Hello out there, and thanks for tuning in to All Bodies Outside. This is your host, Ryan Peterson. Today's guest is Coach Annie Spence, who founded Unbreakable Strength to help others live richer lives by developing resilient bodies and minds through strength, performance, and movement coaching. Annie's resilient disposition is largely influenced by severe episodes of her own body breaking. At 20 years old, she survived a traumatic crush injury from a tree falling on her, which rendered her with 6 open pelvic fractures, organ damage, and extensive nerve injury. Her injuries required over 24 hours of surgery and 6 months of hospitalization. These operations resulted in 29 screws and 3 plates in her pelvis and spine. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of Annie's broken body. 3 years later, after establishing her first brick-and-mortar coaching business, her body had issues. This time, she suffered from an infection in her surgical hardware that resulted in a complete left hip replacement. These significant episodes in her life have fostered an even greater gratitude for movement, health, and strength, as well as an intimate understanding of what it truly means to be strong, to fight for one's life, and to reclaim one's body. You can check out her coaching business at unbreakablestrengthco.com, and also be sure to check out her podcast titled Unbreakable Radio. So Annie, thank you so much for coming on to All Bodies Outside. I'm really grateful. And for those of you listening out there, I sent a cold message to Annie on Instagram and said, hey, do you want to be on the podcast? And she graciously obliged to come on here. So I'm really grateful that you're here, Annie.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, today I really want to focus on a lot of the psychology behind your coaching, psychology of strength, resilience, maybe negative mental talk, those types of things that can actually hinder performance. And Absolutely. I wanted to kind of bring that together with your coaching and how that helps boost everyone's performance and also just lead a richer life. And so before we get into those kind of psychological elements of Annie, would you be okay with kind of just briefly going over your injury? And I know you've probably described it a lot of times, but for our audience out there, would you mind kind of describing it to them?
Yeah, absolutely. So to put a long story, maybe just a touch less long, I grew up in Manhattan, Kansas. I'm from this area and hadn't really spent a lot of time traveling. So when I was a senior in high school, pretty young, I set out, I'm going to go to New Zealand in a couple years. It was something that I'd kind of always wanted to do and a place that I'd always wanted to see and something that I wanted to do before going to college. And so I went through a program called WOOF, which is the World Organization of Organic Farmers, where you essentially exchange labor on a farm or of a farming situation adjacent, right? Doing, yard work, housework, et cetera, in exchange for food and housing. And so I flew to New Zealand, January 2016, had a really, really wonderful time doing a garlic harvest with a couple of farmers named Claire and Mike on the North Island in the Apotiki Bay. And so just, had this really beautiful experience. And one of my friends that lives there, that's also from Manhattan, actually, had tickets to their Kiwi Burn, which is essentially their Burning Man festival. So I had some time between my jobs and nowhere to stay. So I thought, okay, this is way more fun than staying in a hostel. I'll go to this event. I'll be outdoors, right? We'll go camping. It'll be a really great time. And so had a really, really fun time. Couple nights in, essentially there was an event where a tree in the wood, there was a poplar tree that had 2 trunks, and the trunks had been too divergent. One got too heavy and essentially fell across 6 of the tents. And I was in one of those tents with my friend Shannon. And so the other 5 tents were completely empty at the time. They were all flattened. So it was really good that no one was in them. And our tent, it kind of fell across. And so the sum total of that was that I broke my pelvis in 6 places and had some pretty severe organ damage. And so I spent sum total nearly 6 months in New Zealand and had an injury that the physicians there and the orthopedic surgeon described as the most severe pelvic crush injury they'd ever seen. Wow. I stayed on the orthopedic ward longer than they'd had any other patient stay, with the exception of a fellow they told me about in the 80s who had an oil drum fall on him. And so, really was put in this position where I'm, Dorothy's not in Kansas anymore, like on the opposite side of the globe. And, just relying on these people in New Zealand to take care for me. And so, I think that the experience was obviously like tremendously traumatic, but has also then informed a lot about how I think about, mortality and my well-being and how I spend my time. And so all of that has kind of pushed me towards trying to share something meaningful with other people through strength. Because, the other kind of undercurrent to this is that I'd started weightlifting really young. I was 12 years old when I got into weightlifting, and then had done some powerlifting through middle school and high school. And so in the hospital, they were able to put a really extensive amount of hardware, which you can only do if there's bone stock that will support that. And so the surgeons had noted that if I hadn't been so invested in heavy weightlifting for a time prior, they didn't think that my spine or that my pelvis would have, that would have shattered much worse or shattered irreparably, or that there wouldn't have been the bone stock to put hardware in to allow it to heal. And so for me, it was just kind of like a situation of weightlifting saved my life. And I think also provided a grounding psychological construct, from this background of just maybe we build some toughness through doing difficult stuff. Right. And so I think I felt that I benefited from that, and it was important to me to share that with other people.
Yeah, well, it sounds like that your fitness before that injury was really helpful. As you mentioned with the bone stock, I'm also sure it helped with your recovery. But I wanted to touch on when you were younger and lifting weights and whatnot. What were your mentors like, and what did they teach you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had kind of an interesting time. I was like not an athletic child in grade school. I didn't really play sports. I definitely walked the mile for the presidential fitness test every year. And so I think I didn't really grow up conceiving of myself as an athletic individual before that. I'd always been maybe a little more academic. And I think that for me, I was really invested in illustration and art and drawing. And so as a small person, I thought I want to be an illustrator. And so I got all of these books that were photo references of bodybuilders and weightlifters. And one in particular by a French illustrator named Frédéric Delavier has a book called Strength Training Anatomy. And so the illustrations in it are just beautiful. And he's an incredible illustrator. And so I think that seeing that, and that book in particular, because really all it is this like lexicon of exercises, but illustrated with principles really well. And that was just really inspiring to me. And I kind of thought wow, it's one thing to draw this, but maybe I could do this stuff. And so I think that was the initial spark. And there was a kind of a sweet, grungy 80s feeling bodybuilder gym in town called Pro Fitness back in the day. And it was in a basement. And so my dad had a membership there, and I just went down to the gym, and I would kind of tag along, and then got my own membership and just started going. It was like all the free time I had, I was interested in going and training and learning about training. And I think for me, as in particular, coming of age as a young queer woman in Kansas, I think it's hard to see yourself in some more traditional roles. And the gym was a place where I felt like I could express my physicality and my identity, maybe without some of the burdens that come with being a young girl in school at that age. And so I think it was an emotionally affirming place. It was an identity affirming place. And then in being in that spot, there were several mentors, a man named Matt Warner, Walter Barr, who was a personal trainer in town who recently passed away, that impacted a lot of people's lives very positively. And really, more people than I could even name individually, but there was this host of seasoned bodybuilders and powerlifters that all just were really welcoming and really empowering and very supportive. And I think that, interfacing with coaches, and while these weren't people that were coaching me directly, they were in my community. And I think just interfacing with people who make you feel capable of more was also inspiring to me in a long-term way. Because it's like that, it felt good to receive that. And so I think now, in particular, when I wind up training younger people, it's like, I hope that they wind up with the same feeling that I was gifted to receive at that age,
Yeah, that's what a wonderful story, how empowering they were and emotionally affirming and identity affirming. Like, what a great place that was to just really get started and have that foundation. And how has that led to you being a coach who is helping people become more resilient? And there's a lot of things that probably lead to you helping other people be resilient, especially, a lot of your different experiences that you've had. But How is that touched upon in your training?
Sure, absolutely. And so I think there's a couple layers to this where we have the kind of concept around the physical portion of exercise, right? The exercise science and that physiology is really exciting and really fun. And so I think that, of course, any type of successful coaching, I think has to have an underpinning of that academic quality underneath it. And so that's something that I've spent a great deal of time because of my injury, trying to understand anatomy and physiology and biomechanics and how best to orchestrate those things. But I think outside of the hard skills of coaching, if you will, that the softer element there is how you treat people and how you interact with people. And I remember quite some time ago watching a TED Talk, and it was about our expectations of people and how our expectations of people have a very measurable impact on what they actually wind up becoming capable of. And so I think that that really spoke to me. And it was like, in teaching and in coaching professions, I think it's not uncommon for us to interface with people who are slower to learn or who struggle. And I think sometimes coaches or instructors can become cynical or start to expect less of those people. And so for me, I think it starts with making a really clear commitment to the individual that supporting them well means truly believing that they're capable of something more, and that whatever it is that they're struggling with, they can overcome. And so I think that there's like a really kind of a belief factor and a real love for other people that has to be there. For me, I think that being resilient or being anti-fragile, it's like we come into things that disrupt our lives, things that disrupt our bodies, and that it's tremendously hard to predict and prevent those things. And so really the best alternative to being able to predict or prevent is to be really well prepared. And I think that preparing your mind and your body is, kind of the underpinning towards that more broad kind of concept of resilience. That was a bit leafy, but I'm not sure.
That was fantastic. Yeah, I love it. I love it a lot. I love the direction that we're going with this conversation. And I was thinking about just how you have gone through a lot of discomfort and whatnot. And I heard a quote once called, that was, "Comfort is a waste of potential." I have it written down in my paper here. How do you feel about that quote? Comfort is a waste of potential.
Yeah, I completely agree with it. And what it reminds me of is, are you familiar with the runner, Steve Prefontaine?
I am. Yes.
Yeah. So he has a saying that he said, and he's like kind of known for being like a little crazy, and not in a bad way, but like really intense, right? Really passionate. And he said, to give anything less than your best is to sacrifice the gift. And I think both this kind of construct of the fact that our lives and the time that we're given, it's in the Lord of the Rings, right? All you have is time, and it's your job to decide what to do with it, essentially, right? And so I think that for me, having a near-death experience and being in that moment where I thought, oh, this might be all this is it. I might be done. And then getting more time, I think that we spend a lot of our time waiting or avoiding discomfort because we think we can do things later, or we think that it'll feel better at another time. And I think that it's like the time that you have is a gift, and, not to be too like, what Rocky 3, like there is no tomorrow, but I think in some ways there isn't. And so, if it's not going to kill you, it's just really uncomfortable, then I figure you might as well do it.
Yeah. I love that a lot. My gosh, like going through your injuries, being able to push yourself, like how did you ever fall into a victim mentality, or how did you prevent that from happening? Or if it was happening, how did you stop that? Because that can completely stop, performance and just productivity, and also just seizing the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's a really good question. Thank you. I think when we share our stories, we tend to, whether intentional or not, maybe curate, or, it's like, I can tell you about my experience, but you don't see the everyday. I don't think we see the like really messy parts of that. And so certainly, I've had a lot of moments of like, I'm just really angry and really sad and really frustrated that I have to deal with this, and it doesn't feel fair. And, I think in the moment in particular, when you're hospitalized, it's like, okay, my friends can't visit me because they're in another country. My family can't visit me because they're in another country, and I'm alone, and the physicians here don't know if I'm going to get better, and this sucks, and it's scary. And so I think that undoubtedly I had a lot of moments like that. And then I think it takes deliberate effort to say, like, I'm going to believe something different, or for this moment, I'm going to switch the narrative to, I can do this, and I'm just going to do it one moment at a time. And I think we tend to make more sense of our lives or of occurrences, you know, in looking back on them. But I think at the time it was very just like, you know, one moment at a time, right? Of like, okay, in this moment, I'm feeling like this sucks, and I'm going to choose that, okay, I'm just going to show up and try my hardest with my physical therapy exercises right now. And then that starts to add up, and you start to feel a little better. And then that starts to add up. So I think it's a slow, probably more messier, undulating line than this like linear trajectory that maybe sometimes things can look like in the past. And, you know, I think certainly, you know, another layer to this, and I bring this up only because I know that it's something that affects a lot of people. Anytime you have a big injury like that, there's a whole pharmaceutical thing that's accompanied with it, right? Like, you know, opiate pain medication and things like that also really mess with your psychology and your emotions. And so I think for me, maybe being somebody who can be, I really value science, and I think it's really empowering to like know about how our bodies work because it can help us feel better. And I think that, you know, for me, being on opiate pain medication in particular, and then, you know, in addition to the injury, going through the process of withdrawals, it was like, okay, your brain is doing a thing, but you have power over this moment. And, you know, you can't choose what's happening, but you can choose how you respond right now. And I think that really, like, not even focusing on the long term so much as just like, I'm going to show up right now, even though it's really hard and it sucks, and then maybe I'll feel a little better afterwards, was probably what more of the process looked like, you know, to be completely authentic.
Yeah, but I that's the way I was perceiving it through your explanation. And I like that you kind of talked about, you know, the undulating line, but the way I kind of pictured it was it at least had some level of upward trend. You know,
kind of wiggle upwards, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and like and so overall it just sounds like we're talking about maybe a little bit more focus on the process versus I'm going to be healthy and this is how I'm going to be. I'm going to be back to normal. But instead be like, okay, today I just got to get my shoes on my feet and move a little bit.
Yep.
And so it seems like it's the process that we're really talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, the showing up and the like, yeah, like the showing up is the hardest component. Right. And I think that, that for me, focusing on the long term when you're unsure of how things will pan out in that type of crisis situation can be really overwhelming and really anxiety inducing. And so it was just like, okay, I woke up today, I'm going to do today. And then you look back and it's like, oh, it's been however long, you know? So I think definitely the process was a big part of it for me.
Yeah. And it sounds like you've, through that process, have also learned a great skill of managing emotions probably. So, and that's probably elevated your emotional IQ, but then that's also brought to just the great service that you bring to your coaching too. And I got to imagine, you know, going back to, you know, seeing someone for their potential, and they are a human, and they, you know, love to be loved as well. And they love when people help them out. Being able to help people in that way, I think is something that, like, gosh, like these horrific episodes that you've been through in life though, have also been several silver linings for you to, you know, just have this bigger amount of emotional IQ that you can use to help with other people.
Thank you. I think, you know, something that, sorry, my doggo is, he's part of our conversation now.
Yeah.
I think
what kind of dog do you have?
We've got a golden doodle. We've got 3 dogs. They're being really quiet today, which is really nice. But the golden doodle's he's the Velcro dog. You know, I think as far as the social emotional component of it goes, you know, and I'm sure that, you know, I don't know if you've experienced this also, like with your, you know, running communities, right? You've done ultra marathons and marathons.
Yes, yeah.
That there's a subculture of people that are invested, that are in that. And I think that I would be really remiss to not also acknowledge, like, the broader community of like people in Manhattan, but then also the people in my weightlifting community were all like, hey, how are you doing? And I think that that type of social affirmation and feedback from others also helped in the moment, right? And so I think, to backtrack a little bit, but I would hope, I think for me at least, and a principle in coaching is that I don't ask my clients to do anything that I haven't done myself, right? It's like, if it's painful or uncomfortable or it sucks really, really bad, I promise that I also have done it. And so I think, I wind up working with a lot of people or getting referred a lot of people who have also had hip replacements or hardware who have been, processed from physical therapy, right? They've done PT, they've been discharged, they're clear to do, whatever they want to, but they're unsure about how to progress back into more of a performance setting or being able to do more activities of daily living with more comfort. And so I would hope that, in those moments also, it's like, when people say, I'm hurting, this is really hard, that it's like, hey, I know because I've done it. And I think maybe meeting people emotionally while they do the process. I think a lot of times as coaches, we can kind of start to develop this idea that we're it's like, I'm coaching and your success is because like, I'm good. And really, I think what it is more than anything is like, your job is to create space and to create for them an environment where they feel safe to feel whatever it is that they're feeling, right? It's like, hey, if this sucks and it hurts, you need to be like, this is really hard while you do it. Then I'm here to like be with you while you do that. And so I think that, from a social emotional standpoint, really focusing on supporting the person in their accomplishment of almost coaching themselves in a way, right? That you're kind of providing support for them to become that person unto themselves. I don't know. If
that sounds wonderful, Annie. That sounds wonderful. And is your coaching mostly in person, or are you doing in person and virtual?
So I do both. I do a blend of both. I right now I work on the floor with people about 50 hours a week for one-on-one sessions. 50? And then 50. Yeah.
Wow. Good job.
I honestly feel really lucky. I just really like doing it. I could do it a lot. And
cool.
Then I do also do virtual coaching, and there's a bit of a spectrum there. Sometimes it's for events. I do virtual powerlifting coaching. So I have a couple clients who, I kind of do their meet and competitive management stuff. Then I also do a lot of Gen Pop virtual programming where we either meet on Zoom for one-on-one sessions and this is the bulk of it, is just like programming and then kind of like checking in. So it's customs to them. They have, they can kind of contact me and have video footage review and stuff. So that's a nice option for people that can't be physically here that live in other states or other countries.
Yeah. Yeah. And how does that programming work? I've never gone through programming before, and I honestly don't know how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that a typical intake process works, in person, we do like a hands-on assessment, kind of look at your joint mobility, everything that you have access to, and kind of through that process, also making sure that the client's informing me of, injury history, what they've done, what they've, if they've trained in the past, et cetera, kind of all of that background information is something you have to know. And so kind of go through all of that stuff. And then depending on, what the person is wanting out of training, be that like, hey, I really want to like improve my hip and ankle function so that I can keep running ultra marathons, or like, hey, I have a hard time putting my tent up and reaching my arms overhead. So it's like, okay, well, let's get your arms overhead, right? So I think then that comes into play with what they need. And sometimes people aren't sure quite what they want. And so sometimes there's this process of helping people discover like, how do we take maybe a bit of a nebulous goal and narrow it down into things that are accomplishable in a more tangible way. And so there's kind of all of that component. And then really what it is making sure that we have appropriate exercise selection, appropriate exercise, frequency, volume, et cetera. Some of those, the more, maybe math and sciencey part of training where it's just like physiology and applying a stimulus.
Nice. So it's almost like a co-creation of goals in a way. And is it almost like you have maybe some bigger goals, but they are divided into sub goals to get you there?
Yes, absolutely. And so I think, a lot of people are familiar with the concept of SMART goals, right?
No, I'm not. So yeah, no.
You're not. Oh, so
no.
Okay. So this may require a Google on someone else's behalf, but
okay.
SMART goals are like a common goal setting thing. And it's like, they're supposed to be specific, measurable, attainable, so like reasonable. And then I think like time bound, and there's one other variable, and I'm not remembering what it is.
R, huh?
That's the R, and I now don't remember what.
Okay. I get the drift though. Yeah, I figured it was an acronym.
Yeah, but if you crack open a personal training book, they're like, this is how you should have your clients set goals. And I'll be honest, when I started out, I kind of tried that process, and I found that people really struggled with it. And then I was like, I'm going to try this for myself. And I found that I also really struggled with it. It's like, cool, I wrote an idea down, and now I don't really know like what to do. And so I use an objective and then key results, like an OKR type of matrix, where basically we have an objective. So somebody might come in with this idea of like, well, I want to improve my heart health. My doctor says my heart's not healthy. I want to be healthier. Well, what does that mean? And what are ways we can measure it? Well, we can measure it through, resting blood pressure, resting heart rate, or if somebody has, bloods that are coming back with, high cholesterol or something like that, then we can measure it through blood work. And then what are the specific things that we have to do to check off those 3 tasks? Well, in order to get your resting heart rate down, well, we want to get the left ventricle to stretch out, and we want to deliver more blood with every beat of the heart. So we're going to do long, low intensity, steady state activity that helps lower the heart rate. And so then it's like those things may be different, right? And some things, like, I'm not a nutrition professional. I'm not a dietitian. I don't write diets for people. But, then with like the blood work, maybe some of that has to do with cleaning up behavior on, food habits. And so it's like, well, that's not something I can help you with as much as I can refer out. So it just kind of depends on the thing. But so we kind of set goals in that way. And so a lot of the times clients know what those broader objectives are, but the key results and the specifics of how to get there and how to illuminate a pathway towards that, I think that's the coach's job, to provide experience and support towards accomplishing that task.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're so scientifically grounded. How did you develop that knowledge? Where did that come from? And I love how you just applied it in your explanation. So I want to hear more about how did you become so scientifically grounded in your knowledge of being a coach?
Oh, thank you. So, I think, I'll be honest, I want to give a lot of credit to K-State University's kinesiology program. I went through the kines program here at K-State, and we just have some really exceptional professors and researchers, Dr. Katie Heinrich, Dr. Poole. And it's pretty cool when you start to like get into the literature. Like, I'll listen to other strength and conditioning podcasts, and somebody will cite a paper, and it's like, oh my gosh, like one of the professors at K-State published that. And so I think, I feel really fortunate to just have, maybe attended a university that has a high quality kines program, and then I think some of it is I just like it. I think I also, exercise is hard and uncomfortable, and gosh, if I'm going to do something, I want to know why and that it's worth my time. And so I think some of it too has just been like a desire to know. And I think more broadly with my hip injury, I wound up with my hip and pelvic injury in a position where a lot of my physicians looked at me and were kind of like, we've never seen anything like this before. We're just kind of surprised you can walk / that you're not dead. So, and it's like, well, what do you think is safe for me to do? Is it safe for me to train with my hardware? Is it helpful? Like, do you think I need to do anything different? Like, I received no information on that. I've asked my surgeons, and they were all kind of like, this is new for us. We don't know. And so I think also maybe researching and reading was a way to both ease my anxiety and also to be like, well, I got to figure this out because I want to feel good again. And so I think some of it, maybe was just a desire to know for the sake of knowing.
Gosh, you're kind of on an island by yourself though. And
it's a little isolating. Yeah.
Yeah.
In that moment, it's weird to have I think we go to doctors and you're like, yeah, you're the expert. Tell me what's happening. And they're like, I also don't know what's happening. And I have been doing this for 20 years. And it's like, oh, great. Cool.
Yeah. Gosh, Annie, in the introduction, I forgot to put an adjective in there of one descriptive adjective for you, and that's curiosity. You are so curious, and I think that maybe some of that was fostered from being in an isolating position out on an island. The doctors don't know how to go about the recovery, and but also being curious, though, takes a level of just self-determination and believing in yourself. And so did your curiosity go back before your injury? Or have you always been a curious person?
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. I think, I think I probably always have been a little bit curious and maybe just kind of like a nerd, like maybe just like not, I don't know, like.
I'm a nerd too. So like, I think being curious is kind of like, wrapped up in being a nerd.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think like, I think you think back to like, well, what's telling about like a person's childhood or something. And I think, I always really liked science. And I remember like I was in grade school, probably like, I don't know, maybe even like first grade, really, really young. And my dad had this computer program, like all the DK books, they like make them for kids and they're like little encyclopedia things. They made some computer program that was like a human body, like a virtual cadaver type thing.
Okay.
That makes it sound really gory for children, but it was like a little virtual body exhibit thing. And I remember like not wanting to play the computer games and just like clicking through it. And so I think probably I was like strange and nerdy and maybe a little bit creepy as a small child. But, I think I just was really fascinated by the body at an early age. And then, like collected field guides. So I think, probably there's an element of like strangeness to that curiosity of just like, this is unconventional. Like I think my parents at the time were like, it's weird that you want to read field guides, but like, okay. So I think some of that, there's a bit of an insatiable curiosity that may just be, anxiety, but that, I think I just like knowing stuff or like learning about things for the sake of learning. Yeah.
Right. No, I think it's super fun to be developing knowledge, especially about something you're passionate about. And I know I have a number of passions, and I will like have these major curiosities, and I always try to write down like concise questions, like why does this happen, or how does this happen? Try to really dig into those bigger questions of why and how versus like, does this happen? Yes or no, binary answer.
Right.
And so I'm always trying to write out those questions, and then it ends up leading to so much knowledge gain. And then it's like, I get to apply that in my everyday life, and it's so much fun for me.
Absolutely. Well, and there's probably for you this intersection of, right, like you're, academically very well educated. And so you get like this underpinning there. But then I think in your field in particular, there's a big intersection of both like the science of the environment and like biology and like plant and animal and geological happenings, but also then like how do we as humans interface with the outdoors or with these areas, and how do we affect them and how do we manage them, right? So I would imagine that for you in your field, there's a lot of kind of like intersection between those. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, Addie, you nailed it. I don't know how you know that, but you nailed it. But you're absolutely right. Like there is, so within my field of research, it's a field of conservation, and there's some conservation fields where it's like, hey, like we have an endangered species of owl over here, so let's put aside that land so that owl can live there and they can have their habitat, they can have their range. But my field of science is more bringing a social psychology approach to conservation. Cool. And so let's use national parks as an example. When people go to national parks, if they have a good experience there and they boost their place attachment to the area and they feel like they have a great sense of belonging and they just have an overall great experience, well, they'll be more inclined to adopt conservation ethic. They'll be more inclined to be stewards of the area, and maybe they'll donate money or they'll talk about it in a positive way. And that just overall helps boost the conservation of the area.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you've kind of gotten emotional buy-in, right? It's one thing to be, and I think it's similar with exercise, right? It's like, we know like, oh yes, like climate change is bad. We should be good to the environment. And then it just doesn't immediately impact us like in a way that we're like, I think we just walk around with like little horse blinders on kind of to things like that. And so then it's like, well, I'm not really emotionally invested. So like, I'm just going to throw my trash away. And I think it's similar. We do the same thing with like our well-being physically, right? Where it's just like, yeah, I know that exercise is good for me, but like right now I don't want to do that. So I'm not going to do it. And I think it's until it's like, oh, I want to be able to run with my children at soccer practice when they're older. I have to take care of myself. Or like, hey, I want to be able to go to this national park again and not have it look like a wasteland. So I better take care of it. Right. Like, I think it's
emotional
buying
bonds.
That emotional investment from people is probably really hard to do on a large scale, but really important.
Oh, it is absolutely important. I think it's a great way to also maybe help set some goals and objectives too with clients of just, having a bit of an emotional outcome with it as well, because it will get more buy-in, it will get more investment involved with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's I think you did nail it with my research. There's that intersection, but I think like with everything we do, there's an intersection.
Totally.
An intersection of a lot of things going on. And I loved earlier talking about how you approach people. You see them for who they are, you try to get to know them, but you're also not pushing them into experiences that you haven't tried. And by trying those experiences, I think that's something that's really, really fantastic. And I know like that's a great way to bond with people, get them to trust you, and all that great stuff that goes into coaching.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, what's in the future for Annie? I know I've seen you get into a little bit. So I'm not familiar with, I don't know, some of the MMA fighting.
So I had the total hip replacement 2 years ago. And prior to that, I'd messaged somebody who'd been an acquaintance in town that does combat sports training. And it was like the month before I got my hip infection. I was like, hey man, I really want to start doing this. I think it would be fun. And we had a meeting set up, and then I was hospitalized, and I was like, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to rain check very indefinitely. And so then, 2 years later, got my hip replaced, was like, I'm feeling pretty good. I'd like to do this. And so I train at the Combative Sports Center down on 4th Street in Manhattan. And in particular, I take classes, but I do a lot of one-on-one coaching with a fellow named Cole Fowles. And he just has a really exceptional wealth of knowledge, not only about fight sports, the diverse array of fight sports, but also the social and cultural histories surrounding them, because fight sports are such a kind of international and historical part of culture, right? And so, I think for me, finding a coach who made it really exciting, and also who met me where I was at, because I was like, hey man, I don't really know what this hip can do. I don't really know what's safe for it. So I'm going to try to learn all this stuff the best I can. But finding a coach who made accommodations for me, and who, just was like, hey, we'll get there, a step at a time, I think was integral into getting into combatives. And so it's been, 2 years now, and I do, Brazilian jiu-jitsu and kickboxing. That's kind of a blend of different styles, and did my first kickboxing fight back in October. And so I'd like to maybe get some grappling competition in this upcoming year, and maybe do an MMA fight this year as well. There's not as many opportunities for women in Kansas with that stuff. And so I think, I'm just excited to kind of, see what comes up on the horizon and go for it.
Yeah, I love that you're forging a path forward and you're opening up space for that. That's so cool. And getting into that, were you intimidated? Were you kind of like nervous, anxious, and then having those sensations that actually push you to do it?
Yeah. So I kind of joke, I started, just doing some private lessons with a mix of kickboxing and some grappling to kind of try out what I liked. And then really started liking at first the jiu-jitsu, I think a little bit more than striking. And now I really love both, but started attending some of the jiu-jitsu stuff. And I think for people out there that aren't familiar with Brazilian jiu-jitsu, it essentially is a type of submission grappling. And so I think that, there's wrestling with pins and everything, but a big element of jiu-jitsu is the feeling that you're going to be suffocated is a very large portion of it. And the feeling that you have another more skilled, larger person smushing you into the floor, also suffocating you, is a major part of it at first. And I think there was recently a podcast, I don't remember who, but somebody was like, jiu-jitsu is the hobby for people that don't mind feeling like they suck, because it's just so uncomfortable. And I remember leaving after my first time, and after getting just absolutely crushed into the mats, and feeling like, oh man, I'm breathing so hard, I'm gonna lose my vision. And getting in my car and being like, that sucked so bad. It was so uncomfortable. I hated it. And I can't wait to do it again. Yeah. And I think, in a funny way, and the first couple times you get punched, that's scary. You have a moment where you're like, okay, my head's intact. I'm still thinking thoughts. I'm good. And, so I think all of it was really scary, but also provided into, again, I think in a context where I was with people that felt really safe, right? Everybody's been really supportive, and that at any time, that it can get really scary and uncomfortable. And that at any time, if you say, hey man, I got to stop, that you could. And I think sometimes just knowing that there's that opportunity at first can help, new folks maybe face some of that discomfort in the moment. But yeah, it was really scary. And I'll be honest, it's still scary sometimes. And I think, and this is maybe a different conversation, but having had a really traumatic experience, those things are a real emotional high. Like, of course, they're very uncomfortable and very frightening, but it's also a level of intensity of human experience that a lot of other things don't match. And I think in some ways, doing combat sports was a way for me to approach that intensity in a context where I chose it and I had, have control over it. And so I think that can be really reclamatory when you've had trauma, to be like, okay, I've been crushed in half. And I'm doing a sport where I feel like I'm being crushed and I'm okay. And I think that does something, did something, at least for my well-being and my comfort, that's been really helpful.
Well, it just seems like overall, like you have this admirable quality of being able to find comfort in uncomfortable situations sometimes.
Thank you kindly. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks. I try. I don't know. I grumble, but it's okay.
Yeah. Well, and similarly, it's similar, but not similar. It's very different, but this is one of the things that draws me to ultramarathons. So I've done 6 100-mile ultramarathons.
Oh, every time at the easy, dude.
Yeah, and every time I'm at the start line, I'm scared. Like, yeah. And you can't think about the 100 miles. You got to think about, okay, there's gonna be water at 5 miles. I'm gonna get to 5 miles. Okay, now there's gonna be water at mile 12. I'm gonna get to mile 12. Mm-hmm. But it's every single time. Like I'm so scared. I know, like my last 100-mile race, I was dating Jessa at the time, my wife now, for those listening. And Jessa came out and crewed me and kind of like followed me along the course in the car and whatnot. And I was like, Jessa, if I finish, let's just celebrate like crazy. And this is going into my 6th one. I've already finished 5. I mean, there is a little bit of a confidence, but there's so much unknown and variability that happens during a 100-mile race. You go, your pace goes up and down. You have good feelings, you have bad feelings. But like, there's something that keeps drawing me back to doing these ultramarathons because of, you're going to be in discomfort. It's scary at the start line, but when you get to the end at the 100 miles, I don't ever feel as much self-pride as when I get to the finish line of a 100-mile race, because it's such a big accomplishment.
Yep. And I think, there's something about it, like to go, and I don't know if you ever have these thoughts when you're in the middle, your sport occurs over a much longer time domain, right? Like a couple 2-3 minute rounds is like a totally different, like it's very short, right? It's like, okay, you've got to do something scary for like 8 minutes and then it's over. So like, as long as I don't die in those 8 minutes, it's okay. But I think, I still have this moment where I'm like, you're in the ring and you're like punching somebody, or you take a punch and it's like, this is crazy. Like, this isn't stable, like this is an insane thing to do. And that's like why people do it. And it's like, it's a crazy thing to be like, I'm going to run 100 miles all at once, but that's like part of what makes it, I think, beautiful. Right. And I think that it's also like maybe taps in to an element. I think fighting certainly does. And I would imagine that long endurance events would have to, maybe almost something kind of like animal about us as well. Right. Where it's like, we're like creatures on the earth that survive it. And,
there's a primal aspect to
running 100 miles. I run like a couple miles around the neighborhood, and I'm like, ooh, look at me, I'm a runner. I ran 3 miles. And
I certainly wouldn't know how to take a punch. So
yeah. How long do you typically run when you run 100 miles?
So races usually have a cutoff of 34 hours, and 34 hours I think means averaging 20 minutes a mile. And so if you were to go out to, let's say, Kanza Prairie, and to go hiking and whatnot, you'd probably walk at about 20 minutes a mile. It's pretty casual and whatnot. But during an ultramarathon, you're going to stop. You don't stop and sleep at all, but you got to stop and refuel. And there's times where you just need to sit down for a little bit. I was a collegiate runner, so I finished a little bit faster in 34 hours. But it's honestly, like with ultramarathons, get into a bit of a digression here. I typically finish under 24 hours, but the people that are finishing at, say, 33 hours and 50 minutes, 33 hours and 55 minutes, they are the most hardcore people on the course. Like I go out there, I go through one afternoon of a sunny afternoon in the mountains, and I'm done in the morning at like 2 a.m. I go to my hotel room, I sleep, I wake up, I have breakfast, I kind of hang out, kind of lounge, I come back to the race, cheer people on, they're finishing. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's like they have had to go through their second afternoon running this race outside. They are so hardcore. And so it blows my mind. Like I can have a little bit of boost of motivation due to extrinsic validation, just doing pretty well. The people that are going out there for 33 hours, they are like just pure intrinsic motivation where they're like, I'm doing this for myself, and they're going the distance. They don't even give up on themselves. I'm sure they have moments of weakness. We're all human.
Sure.
But they don't even like give up on themselves. And I love that so much. But that was my digression. Overall, though, what I love about our conversation is it's damn good to be alive, and it's damn good to be able to have the ability. And we're lucky, we're privileged, and luckily, you've overcome an injury where you didn't have that privilege anymore. You didn't have an able body. Like we both now have able bodies to be able to take on these challenges. And it's like, if I got the able body, like I only live once, might as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I love what you're doing, Annie. For anyone that's listening out there, I highly suggest checking out unbreakablestrengthco.com, checking out Annie's coaching business. It's really cool, really great. I love the populations that you're connecting with, Annie, that you're helping. And I'm super grateful that you came onto the podcast today. Hopefully I see you around town sometime soon. I'm not out and about that much anymore. With Jess and I living out in we aren't out that much anymore, but hopefully we run into you out there and I get to say hi to you in person.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for shooting me a message on Instagram. This has been really fun. It's been nice to talk and connect more.
Yeah, well, I'm really impressed with all the knowledge that you have. You're so well versed scientifically, and I love to see a coach that brings that to their business. You're someone that is doing everything you can to help your clients, and I love seeing that. So keep up the good work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you kindly.
All right, I'm going to throw on that outro music. We'll call it an episode.
Awesome.